Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all well since last week and safe. Well, just a reminder that there is no class next Monday. As you know, it's May 25th, which is Memorial Day weekend, even though it doesn't feel like it this year. The next class, which will be the last one of this cycle, this session, the spring session, is scheduled for the following Monday, which is, if I'm not mistaken, June 1st. Speaking of classes, I also believe that we'll be holding our summer session as usual in July, but you'll be getting an email with the dates and everything else very shortly, I believe. But I just wanted to let you know that you're confined in July also for all intents and purposes. You have to follow the classes. There will be a shortened session as usual. The summer classes, about four classes in July. You remember that a couple of weeks ago, we have looked at the principle of intervention with its pros and cons. Today, we're going to take up the doctrine of deterrence, a doctrine that has dominated US strategic thinking since the end of World War II. But that doctrine has come increasingly into question under its present form. Well, just to be clear, today we'll be only considering the state-to-state deterrence. And we'll be taking up the issue of the new form of war that humanity may be facing in the future, as well as the type of new weapons which might be used in those wars at a later session. First, let's just see what deterrence means in international relations. As a matter of fact, probably the term deterrence, which has one definition, has taken different forms, a couple of different forms. Well, simply put, deterrence refers to one state's ability to use threats to dissuade another state or states from attacking it. This logic was behind the Cold War concept of mutual assured destruction. What was a mutual assured destruction? If either the United States, let's say, or the Soviet Union at the time used nuclear weapons, then the other would respond with nuclear strikes of its own, resulting in the total devastation of both. By making the costs of war intolerably high, both sides hope to keep the peace. This is basically what the term of deterrence meant at the time, and still means. Then there is extended deterrence, which is basically the commitment of one state to come to the rescue of one of its allies or several allies in case they come under attack by an outside country or by one of its neighbors or by several neighbors. A case in point was Kuwait's invasion by Iraq back in the early 1990s. Today, even though the possibility of a direct military confrontation with what is today Russia has faded somewhat, the strategy of extended deterrence has remained central to American global power. Washington is still, on paper at least, committed to using military and, if necessary, even nuclear force to protect its allies from aggression by rivals. The stationing of US military forces abroad gives additional credence to that commitment. Now, obviously today, Washington's two principal geopolitical rivals are China and Russia. China is a rising power that is beginning to challenge the United States' economic and technological supremacy. And Russia, under President Putin, has grown more and more determined to undermining the US-led global order. Now, recognizing the threat posed by Beijing and Moscow, American defense officials in both the Obama and Trump's administrations have emphasized the need for Washington to maintain and even to strengthen its traditional deterrence strategies. The Trump administration's two major strategic documents, the 2017 National Security Strategy and the 2018 National Defense Strategy, both stress the United States' blossoming rivalry with the two great power competitors. The National Defense Strategy identify both as revisionist states that, and I quote, want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model. Based on this assessment, President Trump has increased the annual US military budget by around $100 billion since he took office back in 2016, including in it generous funding for high-tech weapons modernization, among other priorities. Now, it should be noted that for the United States, the protection of its homeland has been just one element of its overall strategy to deal with Moscow, even during the Cold War and the days of direct military rivalry with the Soviet Union. In fact, Washington has developed the post-war system of alliances that today forms, if you will, an essential part of the global order precisely in the name of extended deterrence. According to that strategy, the US would use its military power, including its nuclear arsenal, to defend its treaty allies, such as South Korea, Japan, and its NATO allies around the world, not only to discourage Soviet adventurism in Asia and in Europe, but also to reassure US allies. The idea was that countries like Germany or Japan, just to take a couple of examples, knew that Washington would guarantee their security. If they knew that Washington guaranteed their security, they would not need to take action, bold or reckless action, such as building a nuclear bomb that might destabilize the international military security system. But reassurance in foreign policy is by no means easy to achieve for two main reasons. First, persuading one country to depend on another for its security, or perhaps even for its survival, runs counter to intuition, to common sense, and most of human history. And this might be the main reason why two countries, which in many ways are extremely close in every area of cooperation, and I'm talking of the United States and Israel, have been reluctant to sign a defense treaty, ever since the creation of the State of Israel. Because you have to understand that two governments have never similar goals at the same time. And each government has its own national interests, which do not coincide or align themselves on its allies' interests. So Israel and the United States would much rather cooperate, and very closely, in many areas like diplomacy, intelligence, military defense, rather than sign an official and formal defense treaty, which would force both of them to do the same things at the same time. And also because reassurance to protect the allies comes with strings attached. Particularly, it cannot be unconditional. US allies, for example, should not feel that they can be reckless, safe in the knowledge that Washington would bail them out if they get into trouble. And a couple of examples here. In the 1960s, when South Korea developed plans to so-called decapitation strikes to kill the North Korean leadership, the US government had to step in to calm down its allies' aggressive inclinations. And in 1965, Pakistan attacked India in the belief that it was protected by the US security guarantees. And until recently, there was fear that Saudi Arabia could attempt something similar with Iran in the Middle East. Also, as President Trump pointed out with some reason in his criticism of NATO's members' military spending, or I should say lack of spending on defense, that unconditional reassurance can encourage free riding by allies who may assume that the United States will be always counted on to pick up the bill for collective defense. At the same time, however, Trump's rhetoric since his election has helped increase doubts about US credibility in that respect. As you know, he openly questioned the value of US alliances and disparaged key US allies. At times, he even challenged the very logic of extended deterrence, of the extended deterrence concept by expressing his perplexity that the US would have the obligation to defend, I don't know if you remember, to defend Montenegro, which is a very tiny, the latest member of NATO and one of the smallest one, which he said could lead to World War II. Such rhetoric can only embolden US adversaries, undermining Washington's ability to reassure its allies. And the more that those allies come to doubt Washington's willingness to protect them, the more pressured they will feel to provide for their own security, potentially leading to nuclear proliferation, that the American diplomacy, precisely the consequences that the American diplomacy has been trying so hard to avoid since the end of World War II. And yet, for now anyway, Trump's words seem to have inflicted little permanent damage. As indicated by a Pew poll conducted back in 2018, it seems that while only 10% of Germans and 9% of the French surveyed expressed confidence that Trump would do, I quote, the right thing regarding world affairs. The same survey, however, showed that a majority of the same people who were surveyed in this poll still prefer the United States to China as the world's leading power. It should be noted also that not one single ally has opted out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, nor threatened to do so, nor has any of them even embarked on a major military buildup. Overall, NATO has modestly improved its military burden sharing since 2014, but most of the US security partners still spend a historically modest 1 to 2% of GDP, of the gross domestic product. on their militaries, much less than during the Cold War. And even countries like Poland or the Baltic states, which did increase their defense spending to 2% of GDP, have not taken the steps, such as fortifying their borders, that one would expect if they truly feared a Russian invasion. US allies may be nervous, but they do not appear to be panicking or radically changing their own national security priorities. They might have good reasons for feeling safe in the American fall, because despite his rhetoric, Trump has surrounded himself with figures who are committed to the American presence abroad. For instance, his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is not known for his dovishness or isolationism. And Trump's only officially known warmonger, if you will, his national security advisor, former national security advisor, I should say, John Bolton, was dismissed only after a few months in office. Also, under Trump's watch, the US troop deployments have generally remained static. And the president has hosted high-level meetings with the leader of most of those countries which are on the front lines of struggles with China and Russia, like Japan and South Korea, or Poland and the Baltic states, in the areas assuaging their fears, actually, of those leaders of being abandoned in a crisis. In that respect, it can be said that the transition from George W. Bush to Barack Obama and to President Trump has shown more continuity, actually, than change. But reassurance or not, the main question today is whether the traditional deterrence strategies, specifically extended deterrence, are adapted to the sort of aggression that the United States is likely to encounter in the 21st century. After all, China and Russia are very different from the Soviet Union-like superpower with dreams of world domination. Both countries, as I mentioned earlier, are revisionist powers that want to challenge and change aspects of the US-led global order. China and Russia, therefore, would not be as mindless as to attack the heartland of one of the US allies. For instance, there is very little chance, it's quite unlikely actually, that China would help North Korea try to invade and conquer South Korea, as it was the case in the 1950s during the Korean War. The likely scenario would be in the so-called gray zones of conflict, where classic concept of large-scale military operations would be considered too escalatory and extreme. Only a deterrence strategy that recognizes as much could keep the US-led system of alliances resolute and reassured. Well, let's take a couple of examples. Let's say that instead of challenging openly the US military might, China's leadership decides one day to occupy one or more of the Diaoyu Islands, as they are called in Chinese, or Senkaku Islands, as they are called in Japanese. And I'm going to try, under Michel's wise guidance, to show you the map, okay? You bear with me for a second, see if I learn my lesson well. Share screen. Bear with me for a second. Michel?
Yep, share screen on the bottom.
Yeah, I did, but it doesn't go back to the way it was before.
Yeah, it's not, you haven't, just click it again.
I do, and it doesn't seem to be working. No, it doesn't seem to. Anyway.
All right. You know what?
It worked when we did it together earlier.
Yeah, it did. And you clicked on the share screen button on the bottom.
Yeah.
You double clicked it.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Obviously, there was going to be a glitch. Anyway, I meant to show it to you. It doesn't seem to be working. Anyway, those islands are claimed both by Japan, China, and actually not only the mainland China, but also the Republic of China or Taiwan. Now, the stories of those islands, the Chinese claim that they had discovered those islands back in the 15th century. And, but obviously those islands, they shouldn't even be called islands because most of them are some worthless rocks, basically what are called islands, which are emerging from the waters. Those islands are in the East China Sea and closest to the Republic of Taiwan, geographically speaking, than to Japan and mainland China. And then in 1894 or 1895, Japan took control of those islands after Chinese-Japanese war at the end of the 19th century, and they administered those islands up to 1945, when after the end of the war that the Japanese lost, the US shortly administered those islands up to 1970 or 1971, when Japan retook control administratively of those islands. Basically, just to give you some background on those islands. Now, let's say that China decides to invade those islands based on the assumption, oh, here we go. Can you, wow, Michel is a magician.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. We can say it.
You can see it, good.
Yes.
Okay,
Pierre,
Yes.
so you,
Pierre, I did it from my end because I had it, you emailed it to me.
yeah, I know. But why couldn't I do it anyway?
It doesn't matter, no worries.
Thank you, Michelle. So you can see the islands are basically here, about 200 miles from mainland China, close to Taiwan, relatively close, 100 miles from Taiwan, and then 250 miles, give or take, from the southern part of Japan, from Naha here. All right. So now you see that. Let's leave them there for just for a couple of minutes. You've seen me enough. Now, under the assumption, as I said, that the US would be unwilling to risk a great power war, obviously, over what are effectively a few worthless rocks. However, but by invading those islands, and no matter how worthless they are, China would achieve two things. And again, this is a supposition. I'm just giving you an example of what the US might be facing in the future. First, Beijing would send a signal to Japan and the United States that without crossing, obviously, the threshold of serious aggression, like attacking directly militarily Japan, that it is unhappy with some aspects of the post-war order in the Pacific. Beijing would also hope to drive a wedge between Tokyo and Washington that would make Japan feel more exposed, more vulnerable, and less confident on other issues in the years to come, thereby opening East Asia and the Western Pacific to Chinese domination. Okay, so now we can remove. Okay, thank you, Michel. So far, Washington has not taken a formal position, an official position on who should control those islands, even though it acknowledges that Japan now administers them and that its security treaty with Tokyo should therefore apply to their defense. That being said, once again, the question is, would in fact the United States risk a military confrontation with China over a few islands of no strategic value? And if not, would the US inaction mark the failure of America's extended strategy concept, which would have much greater consequences in the future than the loss of one or several of those islands? Second example, let's also suppose that Russia one day would, as it did in Ukraine, send the so-called little green men. You know, the little green men were called those soldiers in green uniforms, wearing no insignia, which was sent to Ukraine, into a small town in eastern Estonia, for instance, one of the Baltic states, under the pretext of protecting the rights of ethnic Russians outside the borders of Russia, thus fulfilling the promise made by President Putin earlier to protect Russian-speaking minorities anywhere they live, especially on former Soviet territory. But Putin's real objective would not be so much to protect the Russian-speaking minority. It would be really, he would be after the opportunity to seize a piece of NATO's territory, since Estonia is part of NATO, and the satisfaction to place NATO's allies in a difficult position. The NATO's allies would wonder, would Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which guarantees that its members will defend one another in the event of an attack, outside attack, and Putin would hope that the NATO's 29 members, including the United States, would struggle over how to react or what to do. Aware that failure to do something could lead to existential doubts about the core purpose, the very purpose of the alliance, of the bloc. Now, as you can tell from these two examples, the scenario of limited enemy assault raises difficult questions, particularly for the United States as the leading military power. Should Washington risk a great power and potentially nuclear conflict in order to preserve its credibility, even over something relatively unimportant for the United States? Or should it conclude that the stakes are too small to justify such a risk? In the event of limited aggression by an enemy against an inherently worthless target, a large-scale US military response would probably seem massively disproportionate. On the other hand, a non-response would be unacceptable and also inconsistent with American treaty obligations. The reality today that Trump or not Trump, the United States security problems cannot be solved only by military deterrence alone. A new and a more realistic concept of deterrence is needed that, on the one hand, would reassure America's allies of the United States' commitment to fulfill its treaty obligations in the event, an event in which China or Russia are not only, in the event that China and Russia would resort to this kind of limited invasion, but also would show an increased willingness to on the US, on the American part. And also, on the other hand, it would combine, this new strategy would combine, unlike the previous one, which was focusing basically on military might. This one would combine economic and military tools elements and other forms of non-military punishment consistent with the changing nature of the threats posed by those two countries. Such a combined and gradual approach would have one goal, obviously, which is help convince a would-be adversary or would-be adversaries that it would have more to lose than to gain from the use of force. The trick would be to make sure that the punishment for non-compliance are commensurate with the initial aggression while maintaining the potential to escalate if necessary. It's very difficult to reach if you will, to find actually, to define the middle of the road, what to do in order to combine those two forms of response. A sanction-based deterrence strategy should be designed to first to cripple activities, the economic activities of the perpetrator or perpetrators. For sanctions to be economically sustainable, though, the US and its allies would first need to take proper preparatory measures to ensure that they can tolerate any reprisals coming from the perpetrators. That would include evaluating first their own vulnerabilities in their supply chains, financial dealings, and other economic relationships, and correcting them for avoiding by becoming overly dependent on China, for example, or for key manufactured components and goods, issue that has become even more topical since the outbreak of COVID-19. For their part, also as an example, European states, which should also improve their infrastructure needed, for instance, to import liquefied gas from Russia and diversify their supplies from other countries as a backup in case of imports from Russia are interrupted in the future because of a crisis between them. Over time, export controls and permanent sanctions could also replace temporary punitive measures. As for the military aspect of the deterrence strategy, it would have to be judicious, number one, and proportionate, number two, but without being weak. Indeed, if Beijing or Moscow refused to either back down or resolve the dispute once the United States and its allies have deployed sanctions, Washington could be able to raise the stakes. A first step could be the establishment of a so-called defensive perimeter, so that China or Russia's appetite for expansion could be stopped right away. If the crisis worsened as a second step, Washington and its allies could attempt indirect military measures, for instance, targeting Chinese ships in the Persian Gulf that carry oil from the Persian Gulf to China. This sort of response would, at least initially, keep the conflict far from the shores of any great power, providing more time for the belligerents to avoid further escalation, especially for the United States and its allies. It's also probably for China. The new deterrence strategy would require, though, full support from key US allies to be effective. One more reason why Washington needs to respond to these kinds of crises in a way that would strengthen its coalition and not scare it away. It's a tall order, and again, it's a very difficult middle point to achieve. But the success of the new deterrence concept and the new deterrence strategy is at that price. So what I was trying to show you today is that the elements of conflict or potential conflict today in the world are new, have changed. And the US can expect in the future more of this type of reactions from its potential enemies than a direct military action against it. And since World War II, the deterrence strategy in the United States emphasized military intervention. It will probably have to be changed, and I'm sure that they haven't waited for me in Washington to undertake these changes to respond to the new kind of threats, economic, military, or otherwise, coming from the US potential enemies in the future. So there are a couple of questions are already up here, which I'm going to take. From Edward, a few examples of the success and failures of deterrence in recent history. Well, I guess I gave you the example of Kuwait, where the United States, if you remember, has tried to, as a first step, put diplomatic pressure on Baghdad and Saddam Hussein, trying to convince him to remove his troops from Kuwait. And it is only when, after a while, after intervening directly, diplomatically first, and then trying to put pressure on Saddam Hussein through the United Nations also, the US was unsuccessful. That on a second step, the US built this coalition of the willing, if you remember, and gave, in a way, Iraq another month or so, 6 weeks, to reconsider. And when that didn't happen, and some 400,000 troops were massed on the Iraqi border, ready to go, and still Saddam Hussein resisted, it's only then that the US has undertaken military intervention. Now, there are a number of cases where deterrence per se does not show. In other words, deterrence asks as a preventive measure. It might very well be that without deterrence, in other words, without your potential enemy knowing what it might risk by invading one of your allies, that might have stopped that enemy from acting. And in that case, it's very difficult to say when deterrence came into play, because it doesn't show. At the last moment, it dissuaded a government from taking action against the country, knowing that another country might come to the rescue. And the damage inflicted, the cost of doing something in one place might come back and haunt that government. So deterrence is very difficult, very often. It's very difficult to the examples of deterrence are very difficult to give. From Judy, maybe send maps ahead of time. Yeah, that actually, I thought about that, Judy. And I asked if the maps, I mean, I sent the map, and my question was if that can be emailed to all of you. I haven't received a response, but it's okay because you could see it today after all. But the idea, I had that before, to send it to you before the class. But I still, like we do when we meet in person, I still like to be able to project a map on a screen, in this particular case on a computer screen, even though you might have the handout that you pick up when you come into the class. So we'll see what happens, if that will be possible in the future. If I have any maps, to provide you with the maps ahead of time, a day or two ahead of time. From Edward, the lack of response or deterrence of the French in the face of the Nazi incursion back into Rhineland in 1938 served to embolden Hitler in his aggression in Europe, namely Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and later the Low Countries and France. Failure. Absolutely. That example is very good, and I could give you, Edward, another example was the English decision not to do anything about the breaking up of Czechoslovakia. That was even more so, which emboldened Hitler actually to invade Poland. And it's only after the invasion of Poland that the Second World War, as we know it, started. But obviously, they are examples, not only in Europe, but the invasion, the Italian invasion also of Ethiopia, what was called at the time Abyssinia, and the lack of reaction by the League of Nations at the time, which just looked the other way, that also emboldened Mussolini and Hitler to continue invading territories in Europe, absolutely. Another question from Edward, the failure of the British, American, and League of Nations. Well, I had not seen your comment, so response to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, also a very good example. Korea and China whet the appetite of the military leaders to continue spreading its forces absolutely throughout Asia, Southeast Asia. This unfortunate lack of response, like the one above, was another catalyst for the beginning of World War II. Absolutely. Same comment, the United States' successful use of deterrence against the Soviet Union in the 40s and 50s prevented the USSR from conquering all of Western Europe, which was its intent. America was very prepared to use both strategic as well as tactical nuclear weapons, what that showed in Japan, obviously, and the Soviets well understood and feared the possibility. Yes. And not only in the 40s and 50s, but during the, if you remember, obviously you remember, with President Kennedy's visit to Berlin, during the crisis in between the United States again and the Western allies of the United States and the Soviet Union, prompted President Kennedy to travel to the wall in Berlin and to say, "Ich bin ein Berliner," as you very well know, which again strengthened or at least projected the resolution of the United States to defend its German allies. And the Cuba example is also a very good example of deterrence, if you will. When, again, Kennedy's administration gave an ultimatum to Khrushchev to pull back, not actually from Cuba, because missiles had not been, for all intents and purposes, installed in Cuba, but for the Soviet ships to come carrying those missiles to land in Cuba and to have them installed. So the Russian ships, as you remember, turned around and went back to Russia. That was also an example of deterrence. From S. Pranis, do China and Russia have similar treaty organizations as the US, which might put them in awkward situation when it comes to deciding if they should be helping to defend one of their allies? Well, you might know that the communist bloc had something similar to the NATO treaty, which was called the Warsaw Treaty, which had been signed by all the ex-communist countries, but not by China, by the European ex-communist countries and the Soviet Union. But after the end of the Cold War, unlike NATO, and obviously with the implosion of the former Soviet Union and the implosion of the socialist, so-called socialist regimes in East Europe, all these countries got out from under the Soviet influence politically, and the Warsaw Pact just disappeared. So no, today there are no treaties between, or treaty organizations between the former communist countries and Russia. The last thing that the former communist countries want is to have a formal treaty with Russia on anything at all, least of all militarily. Don't forget that some of these countries have US military installations on their soil, such as I don't know, Romania or Poland in particular. So they don't want to have anything to do with, and they joined NATO. So they don't want to have anything to do with the Soviet Union. And Russia and the Soviet Union, to my knowledge, they have no treaty, a defense treaty to come to the rescue of each other in case of a war from an outside threat. Still from Espranis, wasn't the Cuban Missile Crisis a dramatic? Yes, I answered your question. Definitely, it was a dramatic example of deterrence between two superpowers. Not the type of extended deterrence, even though Cuba, if you will, was used as a third country, but also of a direct military deterrence between the two superpowers. So that made it even more dramatic, like you say, and much more scary. And for at the time, in the early 1960s, when the whole globe was transfixed on the daily advance of the Soviet ships towards Cuba. And absolutely, it's the most dramatic example so far. Hopefully, it will not happen again. However, that being said, and that's why, as I told you before, I only look today at the military aspect and state-to-state aspect, if you will, of deterrence, is that in today's world, states have to confront increasingly, I would say, threats coming from non-state sources, terrorist organizations, for instance, which are much more difficult to fight and to confront, and for which states and governments are much less prepared, since this is a relatively new phenomenon, terrorism. Much less prepared to confront than conventional or traditional, I would say, military confrontation between countries. That type of concentration, again, is less and less likely nowadays. And the threat posed by terrorism or other type of weapons than nuclear weapons, chemical, biological. Unfortunately, we have a very good example today with what's going on. I'm not saying this is a war. I'm just, you can see, we can see, all of us, how efficient this type of weapon, if used as a weapon, a virus, can be. And there are viruses and chemical elements or biological elements which are much more lethal than the ones that we're facing today. And these are also weapons that terrorist organizations might be likely to get their hands on, rather than nuclear weapons, which they might not have at the present time the capacity or to use efficiently. So yes, this is a new element that will have to be taken into account in the near future. From Ronald, should the United States lead the negotiation of an international agreement that lays out global digital rules of the road based on the goal of securing an internet future of free, open, and secure trade, as opposed to a likely Chinese model of limited access, censorship, and probable government manipulation? I don't know if we can, Ronald, I don't know if we can separate so easily what you call an internet future of free, open, and secure trade. It's not clear to me what you mean by that, as opposed to a likely, I know what you're saying by a Chinese model of limited access, censorship, and probable government manipulation. First of all, I do not believe that the Chinese at this point, and many other countries, not only China, or many other governments, I should say, are prepared to get into this type of negotiations. Because to some extent, maybe not to the extent where, to the extent that China and its leadership is using to manipulate or to censor its internet access or to limit its internet access. But to some extent, all governments are, in a way, worried about this total free access to internet. And because if you give free access, total free access to internet with no control whatsoever by the government, it has its own risks to be used for not only by terrorist organizations, but also by organized crime, for instance, without any control by the government. You would not know exactly how the money is being laundered in different places and by whom. So to some extent, all governments would like to keep some kind of control of who has access to internet, who and what goes on internet. Again, not to the point where you limit access to internet or like the Chinese are doing in their type of political situation regime. But all the governments, I think, it's too early, I guess. It's too early for most governments to come together and have a conference on the free use of internet. They might have a conference in the future on internet in general and what goes on internet and the content, but not to impose rules for the time being, because it's too early. And even those governments which are considered to be so-called liberal governments might have reservations about opening totally access to internet and its content. Not to mention that a number of governments would even refuse to sit down to even consider such a treaty, like China and many others. It's not only China, but there are many other countries which limit access to internet. And all of them for very good reasons. I mean, very good official reasons. For instance, there are a number of countries which do not want to give open access to internet, claiming that it defends the rights of a certain segment of the population on religious grounds, not to offend a part of the population for its religious conviction, not to shock younger audiences with any type of content that goes on internet, trying to protect a number of people for their own good. So they all can come up with very good reasons not to open unlimited access to internet. I think for the time being, if I explain myself clearly enough, it's too early. as long as the governments themselves have not come to the conclusion, to the definite conclusion, how they want to use internet, because they all want to use internet to their own benefits. Let's not be naive. There will be no international conference on that issue. From Larry, all these strategies seem to rely on international cooperation with our allies. Not necessarily, but to be effective, yes. It would need, obviously, cooperation from the US allies. In other words, it works, this a sanction-based, particularly a sanction-based deterrence strategy is much more efficient when it's supported by a number of countries than when it's not. Look, two examples. You take the Russian economic sanctions, which are respected by the European Union. Russia is in very serious economic trouble, without going into details. And then you have North Korea. North Korea also, and 30, 35, 40, 50 years ago, you had South Africa, the apartheid regime in South Africa, in which a number of countries imposed economic sanctions on South Africa. Well, that never worked particularly well, because at the same time, a number of countries continued to do commerce with South Africa, openly or secretly. So the South African government at the time, yes, to some extent, they were punished, but they could continue to function almost normally because a number of countries continue to have economic trade with it. Same thing for North Korea. If China and Russia a number of years ago had decided to comply with the UN sanctions, that they voted themselves actually against North Korea, probably even though North Korea is in a very dire economic situation, North Korea would not be able actually to function at all if the Russians and the Chinese did not export oil to North Korea, and if North Korea had not had foreign currency like dollars to buy things from Russia. And obviously they do. They sell, even today, agricultural products and coal to Russia, to China, and to other countries as well. So even though the United States imposed economic sanctions on North Korea or on more goods and manufactured products, North Korea continues to function despite all these sanctions against it. From Judy, in line with previous question, cyber warfare greater threat than military? Could be. Again, as I mentioned to you, I didn't get into that today because that requires probably another 40 minutes, 45 minutes of presentation. But you're right, probably it will be, we don't know yet, but it might be very efficient. I don't know if it's a greater threat per se as a nuclear threat, but it can be definitely extremely efficient. As it was evidenced by a number of attempts made by Israel and the United States to sabotage the nuclear, the Iranian nuclear installation facilities and North Korean nuclear facilities, which seem to have worked temporarily, but they seem to delay North Korean or Iranian nuclear programs by a few months or even a few years. From Larry, continue, we are less safe now because of new policies towards our allies. When you say we, you mean the United States? I don't think so, because I still believe, as I said earlier, that at the end of the day, the allies obviously will not turn against the United States and will gather around the United States in case of an emergency. So even though, while there is some improvement to be brought to the tone, maybe more than the substance, but to the tone of the US Western Allies relations, as far as substance goes, I still believe that when push comes to shove, the allies would still could be counted on to come together with United States. I don't think that the US is a less safe place than it used to be because of that. From S. Pranis, cyber attacks versus military attacks have also been used as deterrents in some situations as well. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, yes, in North Korea and in Iran in particular, and in many other, probably in many other instances that we don't know about, because the own government, the ones which have been affected by cyber attacks, they themselves did not realize that they realized afterwards. Since this is a new type of weapon used, and some of the countries do not have the means, the adequate means to defend themselves or to protect themselves against attacks coming from outside. Thus, they don't know when a cyber attack is being conducted against them, and it takes them time to realize that they've been under attack and to realize what's the damage to their economical infrastructure or otherwise was done. So there are many incidents, or they don't publicize it. That's another thing. They rather keep it under wraps and they don't publicize it, that they've been under attack for their own reasons, political reasons. From Doug, Pierre, isn't it true that if any foreign power is inclined to test the integrity or of the viability of various treaties, NATO, etc., right now is in the midst of the pandemic? Yes, but the foreign countries also are in the midst of the virus outbreak. So I think I mentioned that to you a couple of weeks ago in reference to a totally different subject, is that it struck me also that for the past 2 months and 2 months and a half, there've been a sharp decrease in the world in the number of terrorist attacks. Honestly, I was expecting, like you said, I was expecting that the number of terrorist attacks would increase trying to take advantage of the fact that the government are so busy with with this medical issue. But it seems that the terrorist groups have more difficulties nowadays also to act because of the pandemic. So I think it hits both ways. From Mark, Russia, China, communist countries seem to vote in unison when it comes to UN issues, not unlike our Supreme Court, idealistically divided on issues. Mark, I do not see the connection between the US Supreme Court and China and Russia. But you're right, at the UN, most of the time, they would vote the same way, even though I would say that generally speaking, Russia will tend to be probably more active in the veto area than China. China on a lot of issues, as you know, would abstain. Very seldom China votes against a resolution presented by the UN. They much prefer to use the abstention issue. The Russians, however, they will vote much more often against. Also because Russian-related issues have come up in the United Nations at the Security Council much more often than Chinese-related issues. Where if you take the example of the Ukraine, for instance, a few years ago, there were a huge number of resolutions, anti-Russian resolutions that came up in the Security Council that Russia vetoed, obviously. Also on the Middle East issue, Russia is much more active since it has a presence in Syria. So it is much more involved, if you will, politically than China in that region. So China has the luxury of just sit back and not be a direct participant, if you will, committed to the issue, just sit back, express its views, and then abstain, which they do very often. Now, do they consult with the Russians on the number of issues, and knowing that Russia would vote against or veto, then they can abstain without doing any harm to Russia? That could very well be. But generally speaking, China abstains in the Security Council. Do you see, from Ronald, do you see any similarities with the current growing rift between the US and China and the Cold War between the United States and USSR? The Cold War between the United States and USSR was mostly ideological. The USSR believed, or at least pretended to believe, that it was basically fighting against capitalism, trying to impose its own socialist, communist, call it whatever you want, regime. claiming that it was a much better, in the long run anyway, option, if you will, for the mankind than the capitalist regime. And at the same time, as you very well remember, Russia was trying very hard to export its regime to the rest of the world. So the Cold War, we are fixated on Europe and Western Europe because of the Berlin Wall. But the Cold War was conducted all over the map, on every continent, more or less openly. So that was an ideological issue between the United States and the USSR. With China, it is something different. China does not claim that it has a better ideology or a different regime from the United States. And as a matter of fact, when you look at China economically, China has more billionaires today than the United States does. So to some extent, they are encouraging capitalism in some ways. Politically, however, what China is doing is what Putin is doing in Russia today. On the one hand, you have all these oligarchs who are, again, owners of companies and who are billionaires and who can import, export, and have trade with whoever they want around the world and make billions of dollars or whatever currency. So does China. In exchange, however, both countries want these oligarchs to support the political regimes of Putin in Russia and of the Communist Party in China, politically speaking. So it's a hybrid type of system where economically it's almost an open market, less so in China than in Russia, but politically it's a totally authoritarian government. So in other words, if you don't make statements openly against the regime, basically you're free to do whatever you want. It is only when the problem arises, only when you make statements which are against the government. In that case, you lose everything you have, and they might exile you, or they might limit your activities, or nationalize your companies, or so on. So it's a hybrid regime, but China, unlike Russia or the United States, the Soviet Union, I should say, have never claimed to have a better political regime, or not to have a better political regime, but never claimed that they tried to impose to the rest of the world their own regime. They are trying to become the world #1 economic power. And they are very unhappy up to today, and they will always be, as I mentioned also in previous instances. China still sees the US presence in Asia, per se, as a political anomaly. And they will do their best to chase the United States from Asia, considering that Asia, it's in their backyard, and they should therefore exercise political influence on its neighbors, very much like the United States exercises its political influence in its own backyard, the Monroe Doctrine in South America. So it's more a question of geopolitical strategy for the Chinese than ideological strategy, like it was for the Soviet Union. So if you ask me for a difference between the rivalry between the United States and China, and the United States and the former USSR, I would say that that's the one that I see. One was ideological. The other one is more economic and political, but not ideological. The Chinese do not pretend to impose their own regime or political views on other countries. But they do not want the Americans to be present in, for instance, in Japan or in South Korea or in the Philippines or in Indonesia or in Singapore. They want to be able to exercise their own influence in those countries, not necessarily by imposing their own regime in those countries, but by having friendly governments and dealing with them without any US interference. Basically, that's how I see personally the difference. And from Shelley. Bonjour, Pierre. Bonjour, Shelley. I don't know if you're, Shelley, just in 2 seconds for something, a subject that is more important to you than to the rest of the people there. I just mentioned to Barbara early and to Guillaume earlier before we started that there are very good chances that we start our French classes again in July for the summer session, starting July, middle of July. And you'll be getting an email from the Adult School of Montclair, online also, obviously. Now, très intéressant comme toujours. If nuclear threat no longer realistic, is no longer a realistic deterrent, why shouldn't US reduce military spending rather than continually increasing it? I never said that the nuclear threat is no longer realistic. It's still very much on the table. I just said that the chances for a nuclear direct hit from Russia or China seems to be fading somewhat. But I never said the nuclear threat is still very much on. So that's number one. Number two, I don't know how much of the percentage of the American military spending goes into nuclear weapons and how much of it goes into the new weapons, again, cyberspace, chemical weapons, or other type of weapons that we cannot even, for the time being, imagine. The type of weapons, how much of that money spending goes into those type of weapons. And so therefore, I don't believe that the US will be reducing military spending, continually increasing it. That is also not quite so, because in the Obama years, the military spending had gone down to some extent compared to George W. Bush's years. So Trump brought them up, indeed, increased the budget, and it increased the budget to bring it up to a higher level than it was under George W. Bush's presidency. But I think that a lot of that money, again, went into the new forms of weapons, where obviously every country wants to have an advantage over the other ones. And since these weapons are more and more expensive, there is a lot of money that went into research and development of this new type of weapons. From Tom, reabsorbing Taiwan has always been near, if not at the top of China's wish list. To what degree do you think the USA would be willing to defend Taiwan's territorial integrity? Would our allies in the area, such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia, be willing and able to assist the US in a major conflict over Taiwan in the region? Would it be counterproductive for China to engage, I guess, in an adventure that would be a massive military endeavor that would, if not leading to full-scale war, at least badly damage her relations with the major trading partners? Would your first, there are several questions here. Yes, Taiwan reabsorbing China into Taiwan into mainland China has been one of the Chinese leadership's priorities. That being said, I do not believe that the Chinese are ready for now. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do not believe that China is ready for now to go to war over Taiwan. Number one, because Taiwan, even though small, and obviously when you look at the two countries, they are disproportionately weaker than China, has a tough military which disposes of the most recent US weapons. And it would give China a run for its money in a conflict with them, again, a limited military conflict with them. So I do not believe that at this time particularly, China has any appetite for an open conflict, military conflict over Taiwan. Now, the US would be willing to defend Taiwan's territorial integrity? Yes. My answer is yes. If it comes to Taiwan, I definitely believe that the US, no matter what government and what president you have in Washington, the US would definitely come to the rescue of Taiwan. Would that mean also a war with China? Not necessarily. Again, there might be other ways to dissuade China from, through deterrence, economic or otherwise, to inflict damage to China without necessarily going to war with Beijing. But I do believe that in one form or another, the US would definitely come to the defense of Taiwan, and also that the allies in the region, Japan and South Korea, would do the same, if nothing else, because they would know that probably down the line, they will be the next in line, actually, if they do not intervene. So I do believe there would be a coalition against mainland China in such a case. Under what form? It's difficult for me to tell, I don't know. But there would definitely, this coalition of a number of countries in Asia would definitely come to rescue. It would definitely also be counterproductive for China to engage in what you call, and very rightly so, an adventure, which might not be massive, leading to a full-scale war, but on the other hand, that might risk to developing into something much bigger than the Chinese leadership is ready to accept. And badly damaging China's relation with its major trading partners, definitely also. Well, look at what is happening today and how much China has damaged its relations with the rest of the world, not only with its major trading partners, but because of its initial positions on the virus and its outbreak. It definitely, other countries came to doubt China's leadership's sincerity and openness on different issues, including the outbreak of the virus. So it will take China a little time to go back to where it was before, because countries will be looking at China in a different way once this medical crisis is over. From Edward, please answer Alan iPad question about in regard to Seattle. Edward, you Alan's lawyer. I'm sorry, but I haven't seen. It's not that I wouldn't answer Alan's. Oh, here it is. Sorry about that. I jumped over his question, and I'm sorry. Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was formed to provide deterrence in Asia. Why was it disbanded? That's a good question. Was it disbanded, Alan? Are you sure it was disbanded? I'm not sure. That I don't know. To be perfectly honest with you, first of all, I don't know if it was intended to provide deterrence in Asia, or it was intended to promote trade within Asian countries.
Pierre, I believe it was disbanded in the late 1970s. And my understanding when I first knew about it was that it was deterrence against communist aggression.
Against mainland China, in other words?
Mainly China, but I guess at the time was Russia as well, fears of that.
Okay.
And it was disbanded, and there were some people, some of the nations started withdrawing from it. I don't remember which ones. And then it just seemed to disappear. I guess it wasn't renewed or whatever.
I'm going to look into it, Alan. I was not aware that it was disbanded, number one. And to me it was but again, I can be totally wrong. It was, its main objective was to promote closer relations, but mostly commercial relations within its members. Now I might be wrong. Again, it's a good question. I'll look it up for next time.
Yes, I will look into it a little more also.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Alan.
It was disbanded in June 1977.
It was suspended or disbanded?
Let me just go back and double check.
Okay, if it's suspended, that's a different, if it's suspended, it's a different story than totally just disbanding.
Is there any indication in what you're reading that it was reformed, or it's anything action was taken? If it's suspended in 1977 and nothing's been done afterwards, I think it effectively is gone, right?
Maybe some of its members did not get along very well at the time either. That could very well be also one of the reasons. Maybe if you're talking about Southeast Asia, probably it would have included India.
I think it did include India. I think it included Pakistan.
Then India and Pakistan?
I believe
I'd be very India and Pakistan. Maybe
well, I think maybe that's what caused the
maybe that's what, again, I'll try and look it up to get more details, but if it included India and Pakistan, those were the years also, and again, that's just a wild supposition on my part. Those are the years where both governments, if you remember, were working on their nuclear bomb. And it could very well be that that might also be one of the reasons if it was the work of that organization was suspended. Now, was it disbanded? I don't know. Again, it's a very good question. I'll try and answer. But I want you, Alan, I want you to know that Edward is a good friend because he reminded me that I jumped over your question. I didn't ask your question.
Thank you, Edward.
You have a good lawyer. You have a good attorney in Edward. All right. Well, I think we okay, Emily. Thank you for sending me the link.
Yeah, apparently India was not part of it, but Pakistan was, and
Pakistan
was, but they left in the early 70s because the United States didn't give them assistance with India.
Okay.
And then some people didn't like the fact that the United States was fighting in Vietnam. And it says at the end of this article, as a result, CETO formally disbanded in 1977.
Okay, so
What
Alan
that means,
right.
I'm not sure what that means by disbanded, but that's what it says.
Oh, you said it's disbanded, right?
Right.
Okay, so Alan is right.
Formally disbanded.
Okay, so Alan is right. It was disbanded. So it's now you have the reasons, basically, Alan, why.
That's some of the reasons. So.
Unhappiness with the U.S. Intervention in Vietnam, even though, in what year it was disbanded, you said?
77.
Well, at that time, the U.S. was no longer in Vietnam. So,
right, I know. But
so
they started leaving in the early 70s.
how many countries were member states?
Oh, let's see. In 54, it was the United States, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, Philippines.
Oh, so okay, you don't have to give that. So European countries basically were member states of the Southeast Asia Treaty. Okay, no wonder it broke up. There were too many chefs in the kitchen, you know. So I'm not surprised in a way that it did break up.
Yet there was only 2 Southeastern Asian countries in the whole organization.
Okay, so that probably answered Alan's question much more than the unhappiness of those countries with America's presence in Vietnam. Again, America had left Vietnam a long time. Yes?
My question is that there is no organization that replaced it as a...
Well, nowadays, I don't believe that in Asia you'd have, you will have probably a trade organization, okay, for a number of countries, in the Asian countries in the Pacific. But don't forget that Australia and New Zealand are part of NATO. So they don't really have to be part of the military organization with other Asian countries. Don't forget also that all those smaller Asian countries today might be willing to regroup. It was the case before Trump was elected, you know, in this Pacific Trade Organization that was led by the United States, which was political to some extent but mostly trade. And then you have the Asian Organization, which regroups a number of Asian countries, the ASEAN organization, which regroups a number of Asian countries, also mostly economically. But the reason is that they do not want to make mainland China unhappy, because obviously China would create an organization, but an organization that China would be leading. So the smaller Asian countries will form an organization against or perceived to be against China only if the United States is leading them, is part of it. If the United States pulls out, like it was the case for Trump, out of this the Pacific States Organization, I forget exactly its name, that organization, for all intents and purposes, stopped functioning properly also. It did not suspend its activities, but it stopped functioning since the US pulled out. So you have an answer here. Nobody really wants to make mainland China unhappy, giving China a pretext to turn on them for now.
I have a follow-up, Pierre.
Yeah.
I wonder whether the fact that what seems to have replaced CETO is more of an economic deterrence.
Yeah, that's what it's more an economic organization than political organization. Yes.
Cool. No, right.
Yeah. You're right. All right, well, that was, I guess, that was the last question du jour. And then, again, no meeting for us next Monday. Enjoy your Memorial Day weekend, again, even though it doesn't feel like it. And then we all get together again on Monday, June 1st.